Good evening, universe. This is Catherine, or Kat Thenquist, and today we're going to be doing something called version versus, which is basically where I take one intellectual property and check out the different versions of it. Today we're going to be talking about the Artemis Fowl books versus the Artemis Fowl movie that just recently came out. Oh, the reason I have this hat on? This is the spoiler hat. So basically it means that all spoilers are on the table. I'm going to be talking about things from all 8 Artemis Fowl books and from the entirety of the movie. So if you don't want to hear about that, then you should probably just take off now, because this is going to be on for the duration of the video. There's not really a way to talk about this without giving complete spoilers. I'm going to start off by giving you a summary of the books as it pertains to the movie, and then we're going to kind of compare the two and finally wrap up with a look at how the film does separate from the books, if it can stand on its own merits. So to start off with, Artemis Fowl is a middle grade book series. I guess I would call it like science fantasy, because it does have some science fiction elements. Excuse my window. But it is heavily rooted in magic, and there are a lot of fairies and there are some demons and things like that. So Artemis Fowl, the protagonist, is a 12-year-old genius who is the latest in the line of the Fowl family, which is a secret criminal empire. So at the beginning of the first book, Artemis Fowl's father has been missing for a couple of years, and his mother has fallen extremely mentally ill to the point where she cannot help take care of even herself, let alone Artemis. Fortunately, Artemis has a companion named Butler who helps take care of whatever things Artemis needs, but mostly he is Artemis's bodyguard. So his whole purpose is to protect Artemis from harm. That is his whole goal. Artemis wants to make sure that he's pulling in some cash because his criminal father has gone missing. So Artemis's plan is to capture a fairy. The idea is that he is brilliant enough to figure out how to do this, scheming enough, but also young enough that he can still suspend his disbelief long enough to believe that fairies could exist, because otherwise it takes place on, like regular modern Earth. Artemis comes up with a plan to kidnap a fairy. He is able to acquire their book through nefarious means, which is kind of unheard of, and then he uses his smarts to break down their language so that he can understand it himself, and he does all of this on his own. At the beginning of the book, what we're first establishing is that 1, Artemis is ruthless, and 2, Artemis is very smart. And that's kind of what the entire book series is about, is Artemis dealing with fairies and then trying to use them for personal gain, and this back and forth of his character slowly becoming a better person. So one of the first scenes that we get of Artemis, and I'm just going to tell you this to kind of illustrate his character, he tracks down a fairy who's in disguise as like a fortune teller. She drinks rice wine. In this universe, that means that she no longer has access to her fairy magic. Artemis says that he has a special cleanser that if she takes it, she will be completely purged of all the alcohol and she'll be able to return home. The only thing she has to do is give him the book. She agrees to it. She injects the solution that he's given to her and then reveals, oh hey, that was holy water. You are going to die in 30 minutes unless you give me your book, and I'll give you the antidote for the holy water. So she does, because she doesn't want to die and she does want to go home. He receives the book and holds up his end of the bargain, and he has Butler give her the antidote, and a whole lot of magic starts happening. So Artemis is like, this is gonna get messy, let's go. And that's our introduction to this character. In the books, it wants to illustrate how Artemis is willing to do whatever it takes to get what he wants, and he has the smarts to accomplish those things. In the first book, which seems like what the movie was trying to follow, in the first book he is essentially the villain. It was one of the most interesting parts of Artemis Fowl, is that even though we follow him most of the time, he is the bad guy. Later, he kidnaps a fairy named Holly and traps her and essentially says, hey, I want your superiors to give me gold. Once we have the fairy gold, you can be on your way. Holly says, that's not going to work. You're not going to get our ransom. I don't know why you have all this knowledge, but it doesn't matter because my superiors are going to come in and kick your butt. Artemis is like, okay, sure. He keeps her trapped in this particular little area, and he has basically set up a whole bunch of defenses against fairies specifically. So he knows, for example, they have an ability called the mesmer, which they maintain eye contact with their target, and then they basically hypnotize them. They give commands, and the commands are followed by the person. The trick to that is the eye contact. So if you've ever seen any depictions of Artemis Fowl, he's usually wearing those reflective sunglasses. That's what they're for, to defend against the mesmer. He has his whole house set up that way so that all of Holly's tricks can't reach him. He is utterly prepared. He knows every step of what they're going to do, the entire protocol. He has familiarized himself with this so that he can be prepared for every step. Eventually, at the end of the first book, he wins. They give him the gold, and he uses a portion of the gold to buy a wish from Holly. She then uses her healing magic to heal his mom's mental illnesses so that Artemis can have a parent who is well again. The idea there is like, yeah, okay, Artemis loves gold, but he loves his mom a little bit more, which is a really satisfying and emotional moment that comes at the end of this book. That's how the rest of the series goes. Artemis will usually devise a plan in order to get something that he wants from the fairies, and then he will use his smarts to do it. Now, they kind of become allies starting with the second book, because they're like, okay, this bad thing is happening, it's probably Artemis Fowl's fault, and they call him, and he's like, no, it wasn't me, but I can help you if you help me. Otherwise, I'm totally not gonna help you. So, you help me get my father back, and I'll help you solve your villain fairy problem. Through the course of the books, he becomes a better and less begrudging person, essentially, over time. There are a couple of little dips and moments where he sort of falls back into his more heartless self, where he decides, oh, I have to do this in order to get this. So it's a very long process of Artemis becoming a better and better person, dealing with basically his trauma, and eventually choosing to sacrifice his own life to help out other people. Artemis is still a genius. He sets it up for himself so that he still has a chance at coming back. But I think he was willing to let himself die for his friends at the end of the 8 books. And that's really what this was all leading up to, is Artemis starts out as this ruthless criminal 12-year-old mastermind and slowly becomes a better person through all sorts of misadventures and battles with villains, and like, oh hey, I don't want to be like this person that I'm dealing with. I want to be a better person, and then him like wrestling with that. So that's the main theme of the book, is Artemis's internal conflict. Some kind of side things. In the books, the fairies live beneath the crust of the earth in a hidden underground area called Haven City. They're extremely technologically advanced, and they care deeply about the lives of all things. Holly, who is the fairy that is kidnapped in the first book and then becomes Artemis's friend, always tries to find the most peaceful, the most kind option. For example, in the first book, at one point a monstrous troll gets dropped into the Fowl estate, which is where Artemis is keeping Holly, and which is essentially being sieged by like fairy commanders. So earlier in the book, Artemis says no fairy is allowed to set foot in this house as long as I am alive. So, and they have to abide by this because of the rules of houses. They're kind of like vampires that way. Artemis decrees this. This means the fairies can't go in, And so they end up dropping a troll in there as a way to kind of defeat him, because how he said it was, as long as I am alive. So the idea that they're going for is basically, well, let's terrorize and maybe kill Artemis Fowl. Artemis has Butler, who is extremely powerful and extremely well trained, fight the troll, and even though this troll is on a huge rampage and Holly is caught in the crossfire, she insists, we are not going to kill this troll. It's a living creature. We will not let it be hurt. She doesn't want to kill Artemis even. She will always stand up for saving people instead of murdering them. Most fairies are like that as well. They don't do things like wear furs because they don't want to kill animals. They're very environmentally conscious. So all of their tech is based around preserving the environment and as many lives as possible. This is going to be important in a second. So you get this really continual sense of environmentalism that you can tell is really important to the author. And it was important to me when I grew up reading them. These are important aspects of the books. So now that you know basically what we're working with, and I'll have to give you more details as we start comparing to the movie, but let's dive in and start talking about that. If you don't know about the movie, it was released on Disney Plus like 2 weeks ago from the time of filming, something like that. I watched it on the 4th. This is actually my second attempt at filming this. The first time my brain was kind of melted, so I just rambled uselessly for 2 hours, so we're doing this instead. So first, I want to tell you about kind of my expectations going into the movie. I had seen the trailer, so I wasn't coming into this with exactly a blank slate, but I was thinking, okay, it looks like they crammed a bunch of the books together and just kind of smushed them all into one, like, amalgam of a movie. I knew from the trailer that Artemis's mom was dead, his father and he seemingly have a close relationship, and that Artemis doesn't know about the fairies and that his dad does. So from the trailers, I was expecting it to basically be a generic hero story where Artemis decides to take on more responsibilities in order to save the world because it's in peril. And I was pretty correct about that. I also expected Artemis to be very emotional, which is not at all like his character in the book. I did not expect to like any of the actors or the portrayal of any of the characters. However, in the first 5 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes, I was pleasantly surprised. I actually was enjoying how they had cast Artemis and how they were having him kind of do some of his more manipulative tactics from the books. For example, he talks to a therapist, I think at his school, and deflects whenever the therapist tries to get at any emotional issues. This is a scene that is taken directly from the books, including when the therapist says the line, "Your problem is that you don't respect anyone." Artemis responds with, "That's not true. I respect Albert Einstein. His theories were usually correct." And the therapist is kind of like, "Okay, how about anybody alive?" Artemis essentially just leaves and says, "This is absurd," and then he leaves. In the books, this makes sense because Artemis has shown that he only relies on his own intelligence and thinks essentially that everyone around him is less capable than himself because he is so very smart. And in some ways that's true, but Artemis is also not nearly as brave as a lot of the people around him, and I'm getting off topic. So that's how Artemis behaves in the books. He behaves with disrespect. In the movie, we don't really get a sense of that. I'm going to talk more about this later when I talk about the film by itself, but as I continued to watch the movie, it became pretty clear that Artemis was not the same Artemis as the one from the books. This Artemis is more emotional and cares more about things like ethics. One of the moments that kind of highlighted this for me is in the book, in one of the earliest scenes that we get of Artemis, he's talking to Butler and he raises one eyebrow, and it's considered a huge expression for him because he's usually so stoic that this is a very dramatic change in his face. And that's kind of how he is. He's very shielded, very guarded. But in the movie, the first couple of scenes kind of go back and forth with his deflecting with the therapist, and then with his dad, he likes being told these bedtime stories, cares very deeply about his dad. And then there is an early scene which kind of kicks off the movie, where Artemis sees on TV that his father has been accused of being a master art thief, a criminal. And Artemis is incensed. He basically starts screaming that it's not true, and Butler runs in and kind of drags him away, and Artemis is like, my father's not a criminal, how dare they? And at first, when he says, how dare they, I'm thinking, okay, this is kind of a cool angle. Maybe he's upset that they're being disrespectful to his father and not upset that they think his father's a criminal. Maybe he doesn't care about that. But then he says, my dad's not a criminal immediately after that. And I was disappointed. So the problem that we're presented with in the movie is essentially that Artemis's dad has gone missing, and he is now accused of being a criminal. He gets a phone call and he immediately rushes over to pick it up. Even though Butler tells him not to, he picks it up. He's like, hello, where's my father? The voice on the other line is all creepy and mysterious, and it's like, hello, if you want your father alive, you have to give me the magical item that I want. I've forgotten what it's called. The Aculos. Yeah, so if you want your father back, you must give me the Aculos. And Artemis is like, what's the Aculos? And the voice is like, you'll figure it out. And then basically hangs up. The Aculos did not exist in the books, so I was wondering what the heck this was going to be. And we don't get an explanation for a while. The next thing that happens is essentially Butler is like, hey, your dad didn't want me to tell you about this, but now I have to, so follow me. And so Artemis follows him into a magical basement where all these magical items are kept, and Butler's like, your father safeguards these, sometimes from the fairies, sometimes to keep them from falling into the wrong hands. He's a hero. And Artemis is like, but fairies aren't real. That's a huge change from the Artemis in the books. Not only is he more emotional, but he's also less willing to suspend his own disbelief and change his worldview to reflect a new one when being presented with evidence. Butler is showing him a whole bunch of magical items. There are several times early in the movie when Artemis is presented with like a clue or something about fairies, and Butler's like, your dad and the fairies, and Artemis is like, but fairies aren't real. And he says that like a lot of times, even directly after Butler is like, okay, we need to get this information on the fairies. Do you have any idea where it could be? And Artemis is like, yeah, I do. My dad gave me a hint. Then they find the file, start going through it, and it's like, trust in the fairies, believe in the fairies. And Artemis is like, but fairies aren't real. And I thought that was annoying. I want to pause here and just tell you guys right now that I am not the kind of person who believes that when books are adapted to the screen that they need to be exactly like the books. I feel that when you change media, probably you're going to have to change some things in the narrative to reflect the themes and the feeling of the books. That's more important to me than like every tiny little detail. So I would be fine with them changing a couple of things. So far I was already kind of annoyed because they seemed to have really changed Artemiss's personality, and I wasn't excited about that. In the books, Artemis figures everything out on his own. It's part of what makes him a genius. It's part of how we, the reader, see that he's a genius. In the movies, he essentially has a lot of the answers handed to him. They find his dad's journal, and his dad's journal essentially lays out all the information that Artemis needs in order to be able to find him. But every time Artemis has a problem, he just kind of refers back to the book to figure out what to do about it. Now, he does end up kidnapping Holly, just like in the books, but here his motivation is to get her to give him the Aculos so that he can give it to the ransomer and get his father back. We have the siege on Fowl Manor, just like in the books, except it's kind of messier. They do the troll scene. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. In the books, Holly is essentially able to break out of her situation with her own ingenuity. And even though Artemis has planned for all these things, she is able to break out and throw a wrench in his plans. This is important because it sets them kind of on an equal playing field. They're adversaries. It's not that Artemis is calling every shot. Even though he has all these plans and stuff, he is still challenged by Holly and her cleverness. He ends up planning enough for everything to fall into place as he wants, like I said before, but it's still important that Holly is able to break herself out of the cage. In the movie, Artemis lets her out. And how this happens is Artemis is talking to her. He's like, my father's being accused of being a criminal, and that's why I'm doing this. And Holly says, yeah, well, my father is dead. And she's also trying to clear her father's name. He's been accused of stealing the Aculos. So a huge part of what she's doing is trying to prove that he wasn't a thief. So, you know, Holly and Artemis can have this kind of like bonding thing. Artemis, after being told, oh, my dad is dead, he's like, can I trust you? And Holly is like, yeah. So Artemis is like, how did he die? And she's like, he was murdered. Again, this really shows a huge difference between Artemis in the books and Artemis in the movie. Artemis in the books never would have trusted Holly so quickly just because she started talking about her dead dad. He would have either dismissed it as being unimportant or considered it an emotionally manipulative tactic to get him to do the exact thing that he does, which is take off his glasses, leaving him vulnerable to the mesmer. He would never do that in the books. Additionally, even when he grows kinder and softer, it's just not the kind of move that he would make unless it was for a super good reason. Not a reason like, okay, I want to have this personal connection with you to talk about your dad's death. Also, Holly doesn't press her advantage. He reveals his eyes, and Holly doesn't use her advantage of using the mesmer to get herself free. She just kind of says, my dad is dead. And then Artemis lets her out because he trusts her all of a sudden, and he's like, let's do this together. I get that they're trying to be like, we're gonna be friends now, but it kind of comes out of nowhere, and out of one conversation, it just feels very forced. I'm gonna talk more about that when I get to the how does it stand on its own, but essentially Holly gets released. Then they do the troll scene, except in the books, Butler, who is shown to have incredible physical prowess, basically gets into an ancient suit of armor and goes in hand-to-hand combat with a troll. Trolls are huge. They have deadly poison and crazy tusks. It's one of the coolest moments in the book. It really shows Butler's courage and competence. In the movie, that doesn't happen at all. Instead, there's like this weird scene where Holly gets caught in like a big chandelier thing. The troll is wreaking havoc. Holly keeps saying like, help me get my wings unstuck. And there's no real apparent reason why she needs to get free. Like, she's out of reach from the troll, so it's not like super dire. And what is she gonna do when the troll attacks? It's not clear. She does have a gun, but she didn't use it on the troll when the troll first came storming in, and she had a very clear shot to do so. Instead, she uselessly kicks it in the head right before getting trapped in the chandelier. So then they pull her out of the chandelier, and essentially the ceiling gives way, and the troll who's underneath it is about to be squished. Artemis is there also, though, so Butler does his Butler thing. Only in the movies they call him Dom or Domovoy. I think they felt like if they called him Butler it would be too dehumanizing, even though there's like a reason for it in the books and it's kind of like this running joke. But in any case, movie Butler runs and tackles Artemis out of the way, so Artemis is saved and Butler is hit with the chandelier and he takes critical damage. He is dying. So this seemed to be a reference from book 3, where Butler is essentially on death's door. He takes some bullets for Artemis. He gets shot. Artemis gets Butler cryogenically frozen, and then he's like, okay, I gotta get a fairy to help me out with this. And then after the healing, he'll be okay. Again, in the books, Holly does do the healing, but some of the fibers of the Kevlar vest that he was wearing kind of meld with his skin because of how the fairy magic is working, and he basically has essentially grown like 5 to 10 years older in a day. So he's able to survive, but he's not able to be Artemis's bodyguard the same way that he was before. There's a really distinct loss here. There's a cost of what Artemis has been doing. This is an important moment for his change to become a better person. In the movie, after he gets like crushed with a chandelier, they get the chandelier off of him, the troll is knocked out, and Butler's like crushed a little bit. Like, you can't see any damage or anything like that, but they're like, oh, he's about to die. So they sit him up, they move him, which seems like a stupid idea to me. They move him, and Artemis is like, Holly, you gotta heal him. And Holly's like, I can't because they have a magic jammer set on the house right now. Stuff happens outside, which causes them to release the magic jammer and gives Holly the chance to heal him. Before that happens, though, Butler is like crying. He says goodbye to Artemis. Artemis says the Irish blessing to Butler as he's... Is that a spider web? Artemis says the Irish blessing to Butler as he is dying as kind of a farewell, because that's what his dad says to him every night before bed. Butler is basically dead. And then Holly comes zooming back in because she feels her magic is back, and then she heals him, and then he's perfectly fine. There are no consequences. It's just like, oh, I didn't cry, did I? And Artemis is like, oh yeah, a little bit. It was such a cheap way to translate a moment from the books that had real emotional impact into the movie. Like, there's no reason for this scene to be in here. He's only dead for like 10 seconds, if that. He doesn't suffer any lasting consequences, partially because he doesn't really do much in the movie. Like, he doesn't make all the difference in fighting off the trolls. And there's a fight scene earlier that also occurs in the books, but in this fight scene, Artemis is outside with him, and they're doing all sorts of tricks and stuff, and Butler's kind of impressive there, but it's not the same way that he's this incredible, unbeatable force in the books. Setting him up to be an unbeatable force, and then causing him to basically die in the third book really makes a big difference. It showed the readers mortality and gave a sense of weight to things. The fact that he, yes, was alive, but was going to have these injuries for the rest of his life. The fibers that melded with his chest basically limit his breathing. So he's going to live with after effects. They didn't have any after effects or anything like that. It didn't have any emotional weight. And really, I feel that that's how the entire narrative went. The storyline was extremely different from the books. The characters were all very different from the books. Holly was more emotional and less effective and competent than her book version. Butler was, again, less competent and less useful to the story than his book version. A character named Juliet also makes an appearance in the movie, but she basically does nothing because she is 12 like Artemis, even though in the books she's like 15, and she's been trained like Butler to be powerful, to essentially be a secondary bodyguard. Eventually she'll be the bodyguard for somebody else. In the movie, she seemingly doesn't have, like, there's one little scene where her and Butler are kind of like sparring, but she at no point does anything with her physical prowess. The only thing she does in the movie is bring Artemis a sandwich and remind him to eat. Why was she in here? There's no reason. She doesn't do anything. It's impossible for me to tell how much she's like her character in the books because we get so little of her that I have no idea what her character in the movie was, other than to be kind of doting. There are a couple more main characters. There's like Commander Root, who I actually feel was a really faithful portrayal. In the books, he's a man. In the movie, he's a woman. But I actually liked that change. I thought it was great. She was still very gruff and kind of overbearing. That character was the only one that was really like their character in the books. Mulch, however, was a strong runner-up. He provides a lot of comedic relief. In the books, dwarves essentially, and in the movies too, essentially unhinge their jaw and eat a whole bunch of dirt and then poop it out as they go, replacing the dirt behind them, and this way they're able to burrow underground, or in Mulch's case, to break into buildings. Essentially, Mulch does the same thing that he does in the books, which is he breaks into places, is conniving, and is kind of hilarious. Mulch actually did make me laugh, which was really nice and refreshing because I was really not enjoying the movie otherwise. But Mulch had a good couple of one-liners. There were some good moments kind of establishing him. They also framed him as the narrator of the movie, which I thought was kind of a faithful choice because a lot of times there's a framing device in the books. It was wild to me that they picked Mulch, but I thought the actor did a great job. Mulch was my favorite character. He brought the only moments of joy to me, essentially, in the movie. You can be faithful to books without having beat by beat, line by line similarities. However, this was not that. It does not stay true to its source material. It changes so many things, including the characters, a ton of the world building, and the plot. Again, because I think they were trying to cram a bunch of stuff in there, but then they also did this completely separate Aculos plot. What the Aculos is, by the way, considered the fairies' greatest treasure, and the idea is that whoever holds it can use it to access more powerful spells and do more powerful things. This was, at best, somebody like read summaries online and then took bits and pieces of what they wanted. They were like, oh, this is cool. I love how dwarves poop out dirt as they're tunneling. We're gonna keep this. There's this troll scene. That sounds rad. Put the troll in there. We're gonna put this magical item in there so that we can like raise the stakes. So it's not like the books. My final verdict is not at all like the books. Very unfaithful to the source material. I also kind of wanted to look at it as a story all by itself. So if you completely separate it from the books, how does it hold up?